Imagine the air in Rome. It is not the clean, crisp air of marbled forums or the scented air of patrician gardens. It is the thick, heavy air of the Colosseum, an atmosphere saturated with the iron tang of blood, the dust of the arena floor, and something far crueler, the electric thrill of a crowd hungry for a spectacle. We are at the close of the 1st century, a time ruled by the iron will of the Emperor Domitian, a man so consumed by his own majesty that he has demanded all the world address him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And in this roaring furnace of imperial pride, to worship any other god is not merely a spiritual failing, it is an act of high treason, an offense punishable by the most imaginative and agonizing forms of death. The roar of the assembled thousands is a singular living beast, a tidal wave of sound that crashes against the high stone walls and echoes back upon itself. In the center of the sun-drenched arena, a spectacle has been prepared. There are no gladiators with polished shields, no exotic animals pacing in their cages. There is only a massive bronze cauldron, wide as a war chariot, its surface gleaming under the harsh Italian sun. Beneath it, a carefully tended fire licks and writhes, its orange and yellow tongues dancing with a ferocious hunger. The olive oil within the cauldron shimmers with a transparent, deadly heat, its surface disturbed by a constant succession of rising bubbles that whisper a promise of oblivion. And who is the condemned soul meant for this infernal baptism? The guards, their armor glinting, do not drag forward a fearsome warrior or a plotting political rival. They haul into the light an old man. His back is bent, not by a day's labor, but by the accumulated weight of nearly 100 years of life. His hair and beard are as white as the sea foam on a Galilean shore, a stark contrast to the grime of his prison tunic. His hands, gnarled and weathered by time, are not the hands of an assassin, but of a fisherman, a writer, a man who has spent a lifetime mending nets and later mending souls. This is John, the last of the 12 apostles, the final, living, breathing link to the man who once walked on the waves of the sea as if they were a stone path. As the guards force him to his knees in the dust, his eyes still remarkably clear and deep air, not fixed on the boiling oil or the jeering, faceless crowd. They seem to look through them, beyond the present horror, to a memory, a vision of a different kind of fire. The roar of the Colosseum fades in his mind, its brutal chorus softening into the sound of wind whistling across a dusty road. He is no longer kneeling in Rome. He is walking, decades earlier, through the hostile hills of Samaria. He sees himself as a younger man, his beard still the color of midnight, his shoulders broad and powerful from years of hauling heavy, fish-laden nets from the Sea of Galilee. His spirit then was a gathering storm, a tempest of passion and conviction, waiting for a reason to break. Beside him walked his brother James, and together they were a force of nature, so volatile and fiercely loyal that Jesus himself, with a knowing and perhaps affectionate smile, had given them a special name, Boanerges, the sons of thunder. They arrive, tired and thirsty, at a Samaritan village where the very air is thick with the ancient bitter animosity between Jew and Samaritan. When they ask for lodging, for a simple kindness like a cup of water, they are met with cold stares, suspicious whispers, and firmly closed doors. The rejection is not just an inconvenience, it is a profound insult, a spark thrown directly into the tinder of John's fiery soul. He turns to Jesus, his face flushed with a righteous, holy fury, his powerful fisherman's hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist. "Lord," he seethes, his voice a low rumble of gathering thunder, "do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" In that explosive moment, he is the perfect embodiment of his nickname. He sees an offense against his beloved master, and his immediate, unfiltered instinct is for annihilation, a cleansing inferno from God to purify the earth of such disrespect. He has seen the power of God unleashed, and he is young and eager to wield it like a sword. But Jesus turns, and his gaze holds no anger, no agreement, only a profound, almost heartbreaking sorrow. He does not rebuke John's loyalty, but the violent spirit behind it. "You do not know what kind of spirit you are of," he says softly, his voice cutting through John's rage like a gentle stream, carving a path through the hardest rock. "For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." That sentence was a seed planted deep within the soil of John's soul. For years, he did not fully comprehend its meaning. He walked with the Master, he saw the lame walk and the blind see, but the thunder still echoed within him. The ambition for a place of honor at Jesus' right hand, the quickness to judge those outside their circle, the fierce, possessive loyalty, it was all part of the storm that was his spirit. The transformation was not a single event, but a slow, patient forging. It happened in the quiet moments, in the shared meals, in the gentle teachings on a mountainside. It deepened in the warm, lamplit glow of the upper room during the Last Supper. While other disciples debated who among them was the greatest, John did something revolutionary, something that would define his future. He simply leaned against Jesus' chest. Can you imagine the profound intimacy of that act? To rest your head not just on a teacher, but on the very heart of God. To feel the steady, rhythmic beat of divine love, a current of peace so powerful, so absolute, that it could silence any storm. In that sacred moment, the thunder in his soul began to quiet, replaced by the steady, life-giving rhythm of grace. And then came the ultimate crucible, the final, terrible fire of forging, Golgotha, the place of the skull. The air itself was a symphony of human cruelty, sickening thud of the hammer against the nails, the desperate weeping of the women, the mocking jeers of the soldiers. As others fled in terror and disillusionment, John stayed. He stood at the foot of the cross, a silent, solitary pillar of fidelity, his heart breaking with every ragged breath his Master took. He watched the man who could command legions of angels choose to be broken. He heard the man who he once wanted to call down fire from heaven whisper a prayer that shattered his understanding of power. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." That was the moment the thunder died forever. He finally saw true power, and it looked nothing like a destructive lightning bolt. It looked like forgiveness. It looked like sacrifice. It looked like a love so immense that it could absorb all the hatred of the world and not be extinguished. When Jesus, in his final, agonizing breaths, looked down and entrusted his own mother into John's care, "Behold your son. Behold your mother." It was not just a practical command. It was an anointing. The Son of Thunder was reborn as the Son of Consolation. The Apostle of righteous power had become, for all time, the Apostle of sacrificial love. This was the fire that had truly forged his soul. And now, this same John, this vessel of love, kneels in the Roman dust, facing a different fire, one born not of love, but of hate. The crowd screams for his death. The centurion, his face impassive, gives the final signal. The burly guard seize his frail old arms. They lift him, the last witness, the beloved disciple, the final apostle, and hold him suspended over the seething, bubbling cauldron. The heat rises in a suffocating wave, the acrid stench of the boiling oil filling his nostrils. To the world, this was the end. The moment had arrived. The sentence was now to be carried out. He was airborne. For a brief, terrifying second, the world was a blur of hostile faces, jeering mouths, and the vast, unforgiving blue of the Roman sky. The guards, their muscles straining, grunted with the effort of heaving him over the cauldron's bronze lip. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp. In that moment, John was not an apostle, not a saint, but simply a man, his body braced for an agony beyond human comprehension. The heat, even from a distance, was a physical blow, a solid wall of scorching air that promised to melt flesh from bone. He closed his eyes, not in fear, but in resignation, his final earthly thought a whispered prayer, a silent surrender to the God he had served for a lifetime. Then he fell. There was a great splash. A plume of searing oil erupted upwards, hissing as droplets struck the hot metal sides of the cauldron. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath, a sudden silence falling over the thousands who had been roaring for blood just a moment before. They leaned forward, craning their necks, their eyes wide with a morbid fascination, expecting to see a body thrashing in its death throes, to hear screams that would be mercifully short-lived. The Emperor Domitian himself, seated in his imperial box, leaned forward, a grim, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. This, he thought, is the fate of those who defy a god. But no scream came. There was no thrashing. The oil settled. Its surface, once violently disturbed, grew calm again, the bubbles rising around the submerged form with an unnatural gentleness. And then, slowly, majestically, John rose. He did not fight his way to the surface, gasping for air. He ascended, as if lifted by an unseen hand. The boiling oil, which should have been stripping his skin and boiling his blood, cascaded from his shoulders like a silken robe. It clung to his white hair and beard, not as a destructive agent, but like a holy anointing, making them shine with a brilliant golden light under the Roman sun. He stood up in the center of the cauldron. He stood not as a victim, but as a victor. His old, frail body seemed imbued with a new, unearthly strength. There was no trace of pain on his face, only a profound and luminous peace. He opened his eyes, and they were not the eyes of a man being tortured, but of a man seeing into another world. He looked out, not at the stunned faces of his tormentors, but past them, as if gazing upon a heavenly court that had just rendered its own final verdict. The silence in the Colosseum became absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with disbelief and a dawning, primal fear. The smirk vanished from Domitian's face, replaced by a mask of chalky white shock. His generals and senators exchanged nervous, wide-eyed glances. The guards who had thrown John in stumbled back, their hands trembling, their faces pale with terror. They had seen men die in 100 gruesome ways, but they had never seen anything like this. This was not human endurance. This was a defiance of the very laws of nature. A single, awe-struck voice from the upper tiers broke the silence. "A god," someone whispered, the sound carrying in the stillness. Then another voice, then a dozen. "It is a miracle, miraculum." A ripple of awe, of holy terror, spread through the crowd. People began to fall to their knees, not in worship of Domitian, but in spontaneous reverence for the inexplicable power they were witnessing. The spectacle of execution had backfired spectacularly, transforming into an undeniable demonstration of divine might. The very event designed to extinguish the Christian faith had instead become its most powerful sermon. John stood calmly in the blistering oil, his presence radiating a power that dwarfed the emperor's. He was a living paradox, an embodiment of the promise he himself had written about so many years ago. For in that cauldron, he was a living testament to the shepherd who guides his flock through the valley of the shadow of death. He was not just passing through the shadow, he was standing, unharmed, in the very heart of the fire that cast it. This was no mere display of power to astonish the masses. It was an intimate, breathtaking fulfillment of a promise. It was the shepherd's crook made manifest, holding back the jaws of death, proving that the fires of this world have no claim on the souls held in his hand. Domitian, his face a mixture of fury and fear, could not bear it. The execution had become his humiliation. Every moment, the old man stood unscathed in the boiling oil. The emperor's own divinity shrank, exposed as a hollow and fragile pretense. He could not kill him again. The crowd was on the verge of hailing John as a divine being. To make a second attempt would be to challenge this new god directly, and in the face of such an obvious miracle, Domitian knew he would lose. "Take him out," he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "Remove him from my sight." The guards, hesitant and terrified, approached the cauldron. They extended poles, expecting the man to be untouchable, a figure of fire. But John simply reached out a steady hand, placing it on the bronze lip of the cauldron. With a strength that belied his age, he lifted himself out, his movements fluid and unhurried. He stood on the dusty ground of the arena, his simple tunic soaked in oil but his skin untouched. not a single hair on his head singed. He was not just a survivor, he was a pristine refutation of the world's power. He looked directly at the emperor. His gaze held no malice, no triumph, only a deep, abiding sadness. It was the same look Jesus had given him on that dusty road to Samaria, look of sorrow for a man who did not understand the spirit he was of. In that silent, piercing gaze, Domitian saw not a challenge, but a judgment far more profound. He was being weighed and found wanting, not by a rival, but by a truth he could not comprehend. The emperor could not kill him, but he could banish him. He would send this man to a place where his miracles and his message would be swallowed by the sea and forgotten by the world. "He is an enemy of Rome, a sorcerer," Domitian declared, his voice struggling to regain its authority. "He will not be granted the mercy of death. Let him be exiled to the Isle of Patmos. Let him break his back in the quarries and waste away in solitude. Let his God see if he can save him from that." A new sentence was pronounced. The guards, relieved to be handling a man and not a phantom, seized John again. They led him away, out of the now buzzing Colosseum, leaving behind a city in turmoil and an emperor whose power had been irrevocably shaken. John walked with them, his steps steady. He was being led to what the world considered the end of the linear barren rock in the Aegean Sea, a living tomb. But as he walked, he felt not the sting of defeat, but the quiet, certain stirring of a new beginning. The world thought it was sending him to prison. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that he was being sent to an appointment. The journey to Patmos was a descent into oblivion. The ship that carried him was not a vessel of passage, but a cage of despair, its belly filled with the dregs of the empire murderers, political dissidents, and now one aged apostle. The sea, which had once been John's livelihood and his home, now felt like a vast, indifferent prison wall. Each league the ship sailed from the coast of Ephesus was another stitch sewing him out of the fabric of the world, away from the churches he loved, the flock he had nurtured. He was old, and the chill of the sea spray seeped into his bones, a constant reminder of his solitude. Patmos, when it finally rose from the horizon, was exactly as Domitian had intended. A jagged, desolate rock, thrusting out of the Aegean Sea. It was a place stripped of all gentleness. There were no rolling hills, no fertile fields, only sharp, volcanic rock, sparse, thorny shrubs, clinging desperately to life, and the ceaseless assault of the wind and sun. This was a place where hope came to die. The Romans called it the Isle of the Forgotten, and it was here, in the island's quarry, that John's sentence was to be served. His days fell into a brutal, monotonous rhythm. At dawn, he would be herded with the other prisoners into the quarry, a great, sun-blasted scar on the side of the island. His task, like theirs, was simple and soul-crushing: to break rocks. The hammer, once heavy in the hands of a young man, was an almost unbearable weight for the aged apostle. The sun beat down without mercy, reflecting off the pale stone with a blinding glare. Dust filled his lungs, thirst cracked his lips, and every night he would return to his cold, damp cell with his body screaming in protest, his hands raw and bleeding. The other prisoners, men hardened by lives of crime and violence, initially viewed him with suspicion and contempt. To them, he was just another madman, an old fool condemned for whispering about a dead god. They mocked his quiet prayers, his refusal to join in their bitter curses against the emperor. He was an island within an island, utterly alone. But solitude and suffering have a way of revealing the true nature of a man. The world thought it had condemned John to a living death, to be forgotten and ground into dust. But it had made a profound miscalculation. It had isolated John from the world of men, but in doing so, it had pushed him directly into the presence of God. The quarry, intended to be his tomb, became his sanctuary. The rhythmic, punishing thud of his hammer on stone became a prayer. Each swing was a testament, each drop of sweat an offering. He was not just breaking rocks, he was breaking down the final barriers between his soul and his Creator. He began to see the world differently. He saw the stubborn, defiant beauty in the thorny shrubs that grew from the rock, and he saw the faithfulness of God. He watched the sun rise and set over the endless sea, and he saw a metaphor for the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. The loneliness that should have crushed him instead hollowed him out, creating a vast, quiet space within him that only God could fill. This transformation was not lost on the other prisoners. They saw that his spirit, unlike theirs, was not being broken. While they grew more bitter, he seemed to grow more serene. One day, a younger prisoner, a thief from Corinth named Lycomedes, collapsed from heat and exhaustion. The guards sneered, ready to leave him for the gulls. But John, despite his own weariness, dropped his hammer, went to the young man, and used his own meager water ration to moisten his lips. He tore a strip from his own tunic to bind a wound on the man's arm. He did not preach, he simply served. That small act of kindness was a seed planted in the barren rock of the quarry. Soon, others began to watch him. They saw him share his bread. They heard him speak words of hope to the dying. They felt a strange peace emanating from his corner of the cell block at night. His presence was a quiet rebellion against the island's spirit of despair. He was not just surviving Patmos, he was sanctifying it. The comparison to another great exile in his people's history became clear in his own mind. He thought of Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, thrown into a forgotten prison in Egypt. That pit, that dungeon, should have been the end of Joseph's story, but it was in that place of absolute abandonment that God was preparing him. The prison was not a punishment, it was a school. It was the place where he learned the humility and wisdom he would need to one day stand before Pharaoh and save a nation. John realized, with a wave of dawning clarity, that he was in his own Egyptian prison. What the emperor meant for evil, God was turning to good. One day, as he sat on a rock overlooking the sea, his body aching but his spirit soaring, it began. It was a Sunday, the Lord's Day. The wind stilled, the cries of the gulls fell silent. The very air around him seemed to grow thin, the veil between the seen and the unseen becoming as sheer as gossamer. He was, as he would later write, in the spirit. A voice spoke behind him. It was not the harsh command of a Roman guard, nor the weary murmur of a fellow prisoner. This voice was like no other. It was powerful, like the roar of a great waterfall, yet intimate, like the whisper of a friend. "I am the Alpha and the Omega," the voice declared, "the first and the last." John turned, and his mortal eyes beheld an immortal vision. He saw the one he had leaned against at the Last Supper, the one he had watched die on the cross, the one who had walked out of the tomb. But now he was transfigured. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace. And when he spoke, a sharp, two-edged sword came from his mouth. John, the last apostle, the son of thunder, the man who had survived the boiling oil, did what any mortal would do in the presence of such overwhelming, holy glory. He fell at his feet as though dead. The prison of Patmos had just become a portal. The barren rock, the place of exile and suffering, had become the gate of heaven. The world had tried to silence John's voice, but God was about to give him a message that would echo through the ages, a final, breathtaking revelation of the end of all things. He was no longer a prisoner of Rome. He was now the scribe of heaven. As John lay on the cold rock of Patmos, prostrate and breathless before the glorified Christ, a gentle hand touched his shoulder. It was a hand he knew, a hand that bore the eternal scar of a nail. "Do not be afraid," the voice of rushing waters said, now tempered with an infinite tenderness. "I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Now write what you see, what is now, and what will take place later." And so John began to write. The man whose hands were calloused and bleeding from the quarry hammer now held a scribe's reed. His prison cell, a damp and miserable cave, became the most important room in the world. By the flickering light of a stolen oil lamp, he became a conduit, a bridge between time and eternity. The heavens opened for him. He saw the throne room of God, shimmering like jasper and carnelian, surrounded by a rainbow that gleamed like an emerald. He heard the thunderous worship of the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders casting their golden crowns before the throne. He witnessed the unfolding of history from God's perspective. He saw seals being broken, trumpets sounding, and bowls of wrath being poured out. He saw epic battles between cosmic forces of good and evil, the rise and fall of monstrous empires, and the relentless, patient, victorious march of the Lamb. The book he wrote was not a simple letter. It was a symphony of symbols, a tapestry of prophecy woven with the threads of his own experience. The persecution under Domitian, the suffering of the faithful, the arrogance of worldly power, it was all there, but now seen within the grand overarching narrative of God's ultimate triumph. He who had been forged in the fire was now describing the final, refining fire that would purify the world. Years passed. The quarry stole the last of his physical strength, but his spirit grew ever stronger. He finished his great work, entrusting the precious scrolls to secret believers who visited the island. Then, one day, news arrived on a supply ship. Domitian was dead, assassinated in his own palace. The new emperor, Nerva, was a milder man, and a decree was issued, pardoning many of those exiled for political and religious reasons. John's chains were struck off. He was free. He returned not to Jerusalem, which lay in ruins, but to Ephesus, the great city where he had last ministered. He was now a living legend, a man who had walked out of a cauldron of boiling oil and returned from the Isle of the Dead. But he carried himself with a profound humility. The man who had once vied for a seat of honor now sought the lowest place. The Son of Thunder had been so completely transformed that his final years were defined by a single, repeated sermon. Church tradition tells us that in his extreme old age, he was so frail that he had to be carried into the assembly of believers. He was too weak to deliver a long discourse. Instead, he would be set in the center of the room, and he would lift a trembling hand, look upon the faces of his spiritual children, and say, in a voice thin with age, but thick with love, "Little children, love one another." When asked why he always repeated the same message, he would reply, "Because it is the Lord's command, and if this alone is done, it is enough." His death, when it came, was as quiet and remarkable as his life. He was the only one of the original 12 apostles not to die a martyr's death. Judas had died by his own hand. Peter, by tradition, was crucified upside down. Andrew on an X-shaped cross. His own brother James was the first to fall, beheaded by Herod. But John died peacefully, of old age, surrounded by the believers he had loved so fiercely. This non-martyrdom was not an accident. It was a final, unexpected message. His life had been a continuous act of martyrdom, daily death to self, to pride, to ambition. He had endured prison, torture, and exile. His long life was not a reward for escaping the sword, but a testament to a different kind of faithfulness, the faithfulness of endurance. God was showing through John that the crown of life is promised not just to those who die a heroic death, but to all who remain faithful to the end, whether that end comes in a blaze of glory or in the quiet stillness of a final breath. The story of John, therefore, is not just a relic of the past, it is a living blueprint for our own lives. We all face our own cauldrons of boiling oil, the intense pressures of work, the searing pain of loss, the public ridicule for our faith. His story reminds us that God does not promise to keep us from the fire, but he promises to be with us in the fire. We all have our own island of Patmos, those seasons of loneliness, isolation, and despair where we feel forgotten by the world. His story teaches us that these barren places can become portals, the very places where God speaks most clearly, where he writes a new chapter for our lives. The transformation of John from the ambitious son of thunder to the humble apostle of Levi's, the ultimate proof that a true encounter with Christ changes everything. It reshapes our character, reorders our priorities, and redefines our understanding of power. In the end, John's legacy is not that he survived the oil, but why he survived. He stepped out of that cauldron not so that men would build monuments to him, but so that he could continue his life's single, unwavering mission, to bear witness to the one who had saved him. His entire life points away from himself and toward the Lamb on the throne, a final, unbroken witness, whose testimony still echoes today, reminding us that in the face of all the world's fury, the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. If you were moved by this story of faith and divine power, subscribe to Jesus and Tomorrow for more incredible testimonies. Click the notification bell so you never miss a message of hope. Join our community as we explore the enduring promises of God together.